you shouldn't go back to China, you may be in danger.
He was one of the most colorful political figures in China, Bo Xilai, son of a venerated Communist Party elder. Previously mayor of the thriving northeastern port of Dalian and then Minister of Commerce, at the beginning of 2012 he was Communist Party chief in the huge metropolis of Chongqing. He'd promoted a revival of Cultural Revolution-style mass rallies and spearheaded a harsh crackdown on crime. For foreign correspondents, Bo was a refreshing change from the stiff and colorless figures who dominated the Chinese leadership.
Bo Xilai was a presence like I'd never really seen in Chinese politics. He was electric. I mean, he was this charismatic figure. He was tall, he was a backslapper, he could work a room, he could sort of hold everybody's attention. He was impressive in that way.
He was one of the few faces like in the Politburo that had something to him. There was a bit of his character that you could describe and write about, and he was doing things that were different.
Bo was widely seen as openly campaigning for a top position in Beijing.
Bo Xilai was going somewhere, and he was doing it on the mantle of being part of the Communist Party resurgence.
But already there had been a whiff of scandal around Bo and his family, especially his flamboyant son, Bo Guagua, who'd been studying in England.
There was a sort of series of kind of mini scandals to do with sort of photographs that he'd posted of him sort of, wearing a tuxedo at some balls in Oxford and posing with friends. For the son of a Politburo member to be in that environment and for that to be sort of then spreading through social media, that sort of played into this sort of disconnect between the party and society. We heard through various sources that he had been seen around town in this red Ferrari, which again was a sort of seemed to be an example of this sort of ostentatious behavior that for a lot of Chinese people pretty shocking.
Then, in late February of 2012, the most sensational scandal to rock China in years exploded.
The Bo Xilai scandal was so spectacular in its particulars. I mean, truly spectacular in the sense of the word that it was beyond anything that you could have written with a straight face as fiction.
It began when Bo's former police chief, Wang Lijun, sought refuge at the U.S. consulate in Chengdu and made a stunning claim about Bo's wife, Gu Kailai. The Wall Street Journal's Jeremy Page broke the first story.
First of all, I heard that there was a British man who had been killed in mysterious circumstances in Chongqing, and that this might have something to do with the case, and that this might have been something that Wang Lijun had mentioned in the consulate. The most important allegation, of course, was that Gu Kailai had been involved in the murder of this British citizen, and that that had been a source of dispute between Wang Lijun and Bo Xilai, and that's why he now feared for his life.
The police chief, who had been known, by the way, his signature detail was that he'd been celebrated in the Chinese police press for having innovated important new ways to remove the organs from executed prisoners. He fled into the embrace of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, but the U.S. consulate, of course, didn't want anything to do with him, so they sent him back out. But in the process, he has spilled the beans on his boss and his boss's wife for killing this British businessman. The British businessman, by the way, satisfied all of the expectations one could ever want of somebody in that position, which is to say he wore linen suits and he drove a Jaguar with 007 on his license plate.
Page and his colleagues at the Wall Street Journal were more than a little nervous, running an exclusive claiming that the businessman, Neil Haywood, had been killed by Bo's wife.
We were going after a potential member of the Politburo Standing Committee. It wasn't at all clear at that point that he was going to go down. And we were exposing corruption, appalling abuse of power, including murder, at the highest level of the Chinese government. It was electric reporting.
He's saying that the wife of a serving Politburo member had been accused of murder, which presents obviously all sorts of legal difficulties. So there was a period where we were having to sort of hold off and check with lawyers and everything. And I was also in contact with the British government, trying to get them to make a statement. They were not commenting, saying, we'll get back to you. And then finally they went public with their statement. I think it was on a Sunday. But it was a very brief statement, just said that they were investigating the death of a British citizen in Chongqing. Once they'd made that announcement, I could unload all the other stuff that I'd by now sort of dug up and could, most importantly, print the allegation that Wang Lijun had made in the consulate.
As reporters dug further, the scale of the scandal surrounding Bo and the power struggle in the party triggered by his ambitions became clear, buttressed by a flood of leaks from Chinese sources.
There were all kinds of wild rumors going on, but a lot of it was accurate. And a lot of it was, I think, because of factions within the party. A lot of this stuff was leaking out first to the Chinese press in Hong Kong, and it would circle its way back to the foreign press. A lot of it was because Bo Xilai had a lot of enemies, so a lot of people were willing to talk openly about his transgressions.
What we discovered while reporting the Bo Xilai thing was that when there's a break within the top ranks of the party over something, I mean, we have party officials going after one of their own, then people are more willing to leak information or to tell things to foreign journalists. A lot of people started coming out of the woodwork and telling stories about Bo, and you start hearing things about, Bo's wife, about the police chief, about their business tycoon partners, and through this, following up on all these threads, you start painting a picture of what was going on with this family.
This was a story that ticked all the boxes. It was a story about Communist Party intrigue and infighting. It was a story of the rich and powerful in China. It was a murder mystery. It was the West meets the East. It just had every possible element of a story, and I remember thinking at the time, just watching it all play out, that here the veil of the inner workings of the party were being lifted. We were seeing the dirty laundry being aired, and it was a spectacular story to watch unfold.
In April of 2012, Bo was expelled from the Chinese Communist Party. He was eventually tried and sentenced to life in prison. That same month, the Chinese refused to renew the visa for Al Jazeera's Melissa Chan, an American citizen, accusing her of unspecified violations of Chinese law. Chan had repeatedly angered the Chinese with her tough reporting, especially her expose of what were known as black jails, extra-legal detention centers.
So as you can see, the situation is that there are black jails.
I should know that I'm being kept on a tight leash and that I should have behaved myself, and I didn't. But off I went to go and find a black jail in Beijing, and we filmed inside one, and that obviously did not make them happy. So they just probably had it to a certain extent because of that, because of the activities I decided to pursue.
Melissa did particularly get in their face with the sorts of stories that she did, and sometimes with the way that she related to the policeman who was sent to try and rein her in.
Her departure was a chilling message to the Foreign Press Corps.
I kept thinking of that Chinese proverb where you kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, and I was the proverbial chicken.
The Chinese authorities even warned the Beijing Foreign Correspondents Club not to publicize the pressure against journalists.
We have come under pressure not to put our statements up on our website, not to publicize the sorts of violations that we do publicize, not to do anything which the government would regard as an attempt to put political pressure on them.
At the end of April, the blind dissident lawyer Chen Guangcheng, who'd been confined to his home in Shandong province, managed to elude his captors.
One of my colleagues had heard a tip from a source one afternoon while we were sitting around the office in Beijing. He told me that he had heard a tip that Chen Guangcheng somehow escaped from his, the house arrest in Shandong province and had made his way to Beijing and was in the U.S. Embassy. We found this totally incredible. We're like, this must be a crazy rumor that people are talking about people fleeing to U.S. embassies now because of what happened with Wang Lijun. But it turns out that then the next morning, the AP broke the story that Chen Guangcheng was in the U.S. embassy. They were basing it on source based in the U.S. So then we were kicking ourselves for not having really dug into that tip. The reason why we weren't able to break that story was because then I called up a person at the embassy and I said that, oh, I just heard Chen Guangcheng sitting there in the embassy right now. And he was totally flabbergasted and shocked. And he said, I can tell you right now that that's absolutely untrue. And he later on apologized to me and told me that he wasn't lying to me, that he hadn't been briefed on what had happened. And so he actually himself didn't know that Chen Guangcheng was there in the embassy.
It's a huge deal because Hillary Clinton was coming to town and suddenly all the sort of things that they were going to talk about were sort of sidelined by the presence of this blind legal activist, and then we realized that he was in the U.S. embassy, or at least in the sort of under the protection of U.S. ambassador or U.S. diplomats. And it was a story that changed very dramatically at several times.
Chen soon left the embassy for a Beijing hospital.
I actually got the first phone call from Chen when he got out of the embassy and was heading into the hospital. I was sitting at home getting ready for my Chinese lesson, and I got a call on my cell phone, and it was Gary Locke, the U.S. ambassador. And he said, I have someone here who wants to talk to you, and he passed the phone over to Chen Guangcheng. So, given our 24-hour hyper news cycle, I knew that Chen being on his way to the hospital from the embassy wasn't going to last long. So what do you do with this news? So I immediately put it on Twitter. And by tweeting this out, I just basically let all the other journalists know that, hey, Chen's on his way to the hospital, get over there now. And I was later told by some colleagues from NBC and elsewhere that, thanks for the tweet. That's how we knew that where we should go to set up our camera so they could be there when Chen arrived. So that actually showed how even we were starting to use social networking now as a news dissemination tool.
Yet outside the hospital, Chinese police were predictably obstructive.
People were told that if they went into that hospital, if they tried to report from that hospital, they would be in violation of their visa conditions and would be liable to expulsion.
Eventually, after complex negotiations conducted by Secretary of State Clinton, Chen was allowed to leave for the United States. Meanwhile, at Bloomberg News, Michael Forsythe and his colleagues had watched the Wall Street Journal's groundbreaking coverage of the Bo Xilai story over the preceding weeks with thinly disguised professional jealousy.
They were running circles around us, and I believe running circles around everybody at the time. And I thought, I'm really falling behind as a reporter.
中共中央决定对薄熙来同志严重违纪问题立案调查。新华社消息。
The worst moment came April 10th, 2012, when Xinhua they basically made an announcement about Bo Xilai being suspended from the Politburo, and it confirmed just about everything that the journal had been reporting.
Ben Richardson was an editor at Bloomberg's Asian headquarters in Hong Kong.
We felt we were getting our heads handed to us on a plate every day. And then Mike Forsythe said, well, why don't we do what we're good at, which is numbers, facts, data, and start looking at assets, start looking at building a spreadsheet. Right. And so for some weird reason, they dragged me into that. And then we just started digging around.
Playing catch-up, Forsythe researched a piece about the finances of Bo Xilai's wife, Gu Kailai.
It was really from open source documents. We didn't think it was all that great. But we like looking at documents. This is what we do. And we published the story, and everybody was just agog. My God, this is amazing.
Forsythe decided to do more digging in publicly available corporate documents.
It's a company announcement, and it listed in great detail the assets of Xi Jinping's older sister in one company in Shenzhen. This was May 10th, 2012. I will never forget the day. We realized at that moment, that we had our story, and it was a big one.
For the next 6 weeks in Hong Kong and Beijing, Forsythe and a team of reporters and editors scoured documents and records, assembling a picture of how the relatives of Vice President Xi Jinping, the man tipped to become China's next leader in the fall of 2012, had made millions of dollars in a host of businesses.
Learned about these state records, the State Administration of Industry and Commerce records, Gongshangju records. We started pulling some of those, and gradually the assets expanded. We had to document everything. You know, it had to be documented.
In Hong Kong, they found corporate records for a holding company named Special Joy, controlled by Xi's older sister and her husband, which owned luxury apartments next to the Hong Kong Exhibition Center. They unearthed property records confirming that Xi's niece, Zhang Yinnam, or Chung Yinnam as noted here in Cantonese, owned this villa in swanky Repulse Bay, worth almost $40 million US.
So anything that we couldn't back up with the document came out. But the fact that we'd actually managed to say, well, this is public document tied to that person, and we know that person is who they are because we've got their Hong Kong ID card number, and we've checked it against, you know, their Chinese ID, and we've looked at the photograph on the Chinese ID because you can get that in the search system, and you know, it's all there.
That's not to say this wasn't all paper, based on paper. There were a lot of interviews we did as well, and a lot of times the paper would lead us to an address in Beijing, say, and we'd go knock on doors and talk to people. We were trying to prove that the ownership of this telecoms company in Guangzhou was linked to the sister, the other sister of Xi Jinping and her family. And so in the AIC documents, it listed this woman in Beijing who lived actually in Chaoyang, near Dongzhimen, very close to the Ding Tai Fung duck place, actually, in one of these old apartments, I believe on the 9th floor, one of these old apartments built in the 80s and 70s. And so I went there, and I knocked on the door. And this old woman answered, and I asked her if this certain woman was there, and she said, "Oh, that's my daughter." And I was like, "Oh, is she home?" And she's not home. Well, can I contact her? And she said, well, she pointed to her wall, and there's her cell phone number. And so I wrote it down, thanked her, went back to the office, called this woman, and I asked her, you know, who's the real head of this company? You know, why are you holding the shares for this company? And she answered all the questions. She said, you know, actually, you know, the real head of the company is the brother-in-law of Xi Jinping. And I don't really know anything about the company. Even she was the owner. I don't know anything about this company. I just do whatever they tell me. And my colleagues and I just looked at each other and just were agog. We had just basically on the record sourced the fact that Xi Jinping's brother-in-law was hiding ownership through very distant relatives.
Forsythe and his colleagues knew they were dealing with explosive material. They used code names for their subjects. Premier Wen Jiabao was dubbed Teletubby. Xi Jinping was called Eugene. At the same time, the New York Times' David Barboza had been pursuing his own investigation, which had begun more than a year earlier. Barboza had originally intended to look at the business activities of the children of senior leaders, but he soon began to focus on the family of Premier Wen Jiabao.
I ended up on Wen simply because he's the one that I heard the most about. And actually, over the years, I had been going to dinners and meetings, and I mean, I still do this. I would take notes after the meetings because it was awkward to take notes in your dinners. And some of these people, you know, were bankers who didn't want to be, you know, in the paper. So I would go home and then I would write down some notes about what they said, especially if they said about any, you know, princelings or important people. So I had like hundreds of pages of these little notes, you know, dated. And the name that came up the most was Wen. And I started with all the rumors and said, just make a list of all the rumors out there and then try to look them up. And so one of the rumors, I mean, you could go on Wikipedia in 2011 and you type in Ping An Insurance. And in the Wikipedia entry, it says, the family of Wen Jiabao is one of the owners of Ping An.
Like Forsythe, Barboza made use of publicly available records in China's State Administration of Industry and Commerce.
Yes, this is the gold mine. And then, of course, when I got them, I didn't know really how to read them. I had to have them translated. And then I didn't know, you don't know what's in them, so what do you translate? So everything. Generally, it's like 200 pages. A lot of them are useless pages, but there's a lot of them have little details on them. So you have to go through like 200 pages per company. And sometimes they have like 400 pages. And so then I do a translation, usually a 2-page translation of just the core things, and then start charting with those. So all the Ping An companies I wanted to chart. Who owned the diamond companies affiliated with the wife I wanted to chart. And then any other companies affiliated with this family I wanted to chart. And I believe within that first month, I had found maybe, wasn't really clear, but I'd found maybe a couple 100 million related to the Wen family. And their names started to show up pretty clearly on some of the documents.
Barboza discovered one of the names was of a 90-year-old woman who turned out to be the mother of Wen Jiabao and who held an astonishing 100 million shares in a company called Taihong.
I think it was, the light bulb moment was sort of like I was scared moment. I was excited and scared at the same time when I found that. Because I knew just by looking at the document that, if the government knew, they would be very concerned that I had that document. And so I was both scared and excited. A lot of people were warning me. They didn't even know what I was doing, exactly who, but they were warning me, if you do anyone related to princelings, you're going to be in big trouble. So I was worried about who I had translating, what I was finding. but it was a light bulb moment to see, wow, this is the Prime Minister's mother.
China, as you know, it has a type of economy that's driven by the state. It's not an economy based on private enterprise or on entrepreneurship. And because it's driven by the state, then the reaches of the top officials in the party are everywhere within the economy. You have sons and daughters of top party officials running state enterprises, or they have their own businesses that benefit from the rise of the Chinese economy. They know what companies to invest in, they know where to put their money, they get inside tips on information on sort of what companies might be successful, what companies might list, when IPOs will take place. It's all in the States, it's what we would consider insider trading. In the Chinese system, it's something different. It's an entrenched part of the system.
In mid-June, Michael Forsythe's team at Bloomberg asked the Chinese government for comment on their Xi Jinping story prior to publication.
We sent letters to the Foreign Ministry and to the State Council Information Office saying that we are looking into the assets of Xi Jinping's relatives, have found some of these assets that are in a certain amount of money. We would really like to talk to Vice President Xi, who was vice president at the time, or anybody about what this means, and some of the people at Bloomberg thought that they wouldn't take this that seriously. Others, including myself, thought that this would set off a bomb.
So as soon as the letters went in, then the pressure started, and it ratcheted up and ratcheted up.
In Beijing, they started meeting with the Bloomberg management, news side management in Beijing, giving them a hard sell. You need to stop the story. The 18th Party Congress is coming up. This is a very sensitive time. We feel that this story crosses a red line. This will affect social stability in China, these kind of arguments. Of course, to a foreign journalist, we call that a news peg. We heard that the ambassador to the U.S., the Chinese ambassador, Zhang Yesui, he wanted to have a meeting with the Bloomberg management, and he did in Washington, and it didn't go too well. I think he wanted to kill the story, and that didn't happen. And then he did go to New York to talk to senior management at Bloomberg, and pretty much got the same answer. To their credit, they were very firm about the need to publish the story.
On June 29th, Ben Richardson put the story online.
Quite frankly, pushing the button on a story of that magnitude after no sleep, when it's sort of 6,000, 5,000 words long and it's incredibly complex. It was, I wouldn't call it terrifying because I was too tired, but it was up there, mind-numbingly scary.
So the first thing that happened is a few days later, I had just gone back to Beijing, and it was July 4th, and I got a call from the managing editor down in Hong Kong and said, you know, there's just this weird message that people are trying to pass to you, you know, that you know, you may be, you shouldn't go back to China, you know, you may be in danger.
My wife got a phone call from one of her professional contacts. This is somebody who is well connected in China, who's a woman who had a lot of connections to the leadership. And she asked to meet my wife, Sarah Beth, for a coffee. And so they went to have a coffee at a mall in the middle of Beijing, as one does. And then they moved in a kind of surprising direction, and the woman said to Sarah Beth, "Are you friends with Mike Forsythe?" And Sarah Beth said, "Yes, of course, he's a friend of ours." And then this woman said, "Well, then you need to tell him that it's no longer safe for him and his family in China, and they need to leave." And Sarah Beth wasn't sure what to make of this, and she asked another question and said, "What does that mean? What do you mean it's not safe?" And the woman said, "Something will happen, and it'll look like an accident, but he'll be dead."
China scholar Leta Hong Fincher was Forsythe's wife.
There were specific warnings about how Mike would have a terrible accident and just be found dead, and nobody would ever know what had happened to him. And there was a reference to Mike's wife and children. And so it was very frightening. I was particularly concerned about the safety of my children. I'm not going to name her. And to be honest, I'm still quite afraid of the consequences of talking about it. It was clearly designed to frighten us. And what was particularly frightening is because it came from this woman who represented a relative of the Chinese president. And so I remember thinking that perhaps I had gotten China all wrong, that maybe China was becoming some kind of mafia society.
In further retaliation, the Chinese blocked the Bloomberg website and stopped giving visas to Bloomberg reporters. Of even greater concern, sales in China of Bloomberg terminals, a lucrative part of the company's business, were badly affected. In mid-2013, Forsythe and his family moved to Hong Kong. Meanwhile, in Shanghai, David Barboza continued to dig.
And I was working around the clock as fast as possible, translating, traveling, and charting. And I just found, like, every time we requested a company, we found 10 more. So if you can imagine, this big chart is, you have, like, even with Ping An, behind Ping An are 30 companies, and then behind those, it ends up, any company you look at is like 100 companies. I continued to map out a strategy of how to do it without setting off alarm bells, without letting people know, thinking about who was going to be translating, what I could show people, and also to go around to lawyers, accountants, bankers, and test some of the theories without giving them what I was doing, because that was too sensitive.
By the late summer of 2012, Barboza was almost ready and was getting very scared.
I was worried, about my wife's safety. She's a Chinese citizen, about my own safety. I told him I think I need to go back to New York. I'm not so sure I can finish in China. There's a lot of pressure. I think they'll be able to, capture anything I'm doing. So they said, you and your wife fly back to New York, just finish here. So we weren't even sure we would be able to get out of China. But we left with a suitcase, a huge suitcase full. Very scary moment, because I didn't know whether I would, if they captured that suitcase, what would happen. So I had to photocopy everything I had and hide it in China, and then have the suitcase. And if it was lost, I had a backup. And I was also emailing large document files to New York, just in case I couldn't get out. So I got out.
But Barboza felt the story had some loose ends, so in the fall he returned to China.
in October, as we get close to publication, which I still don't know when it's going to be, but we're pretty close because they have a full draft, I started to have trouble with my computer, with my Gmail, with, I felt people were following me. So I again called the editors, or I emailed them and said, I don't think I can edit from here. I don't think I can finish. I feel people are going to burst in one day and everything's going to be taken. So we decided, they said, well, why don't you come back to New York or go to Hong Kong or go to Japan? And so me and my wife decided we would go to Japan.
Joseph Kahn was by now the Times foreign editor.
At one point that he really did have the story nailed in a way that few investigative stories can ever be nailed quite as kind of succinctly as he was able to get this one. Real numbers and documented evidence of a couple $2 billion in wealth held by the extended family of the Prime Minister. And we went through a process of due diligence, which we would for any story, consulting with the various parties that were directly involved in those transactions, but also giving top levels of the party, Wen Jiabao's own office, as well as the Foreign Ministry, a chance to comment on the stories.
When the Chinese authorities learned what the Times was planning, they went ballistic.
The government got very angry, that we were publishing. They were like shocked. We told them what it was, and they were like, what is this? Are you crazy? You cannot publish this story. And I said, well, it's coming out Sunday. The government demanded that I come to Beijing immediately. And I said, I'm not in China. And they said, well, what do you mean you're not in China? Where are you? You have to come to Beijing. So I eventually told them, of course, I'm in Japan. And they argued with me and said that they needed to see me. And I said, that's not going to happen. You've got 48 hours to respond.
Rather than commenting, they went into something of a crisis mode where they began a kind of full-scale campaign to keep us from publishing the story. David was called to Beijing to meet with senior people in the Foreign Ministry.
Barboza, with great anxiety, decided to return to Beijing for that meeting.
They said, how did you come upon this story? So I told them the truth. There's no conspiracy. I never got any documents from anyone. This is how it really happened. And then they gave me their statement to give to the editors about how we better not publish, and about what that would mean for me personally if we published.
China's ambassador to the United States came and visited top editors here of the New York Times here in New York. They had a full-scale press to persuade us that this was a politically sensitive story. They said it had inaccuracies in it, although they declined to be specific at all about what those were. And they said it would be considered interference in their affairs and would disrupt the then shortly upcoming 18th Party Congress of the Communist Party, which is the once in 5-year event, political turnover in China. So it was a very strong, very direct warning to us of the kind that we don't really hear very often, and it was framed in a very kind of threatening Chinese way. The New York Times will pay a very heavy price. There will be serious consequences if you publish this. The threat was not especially subtle. It was pretty direct. So we knew that there would be a high price to pay.
As the Times prepared to publish the story, Barboza was consumed by anxiety.
I was torn. For a lot of the story, I was torn. Should I do this story? Can we do this story? Can we publish the story? What are the consequences? What does it mean to these families? What are these other billionaires going to do to us? What if I'm wrong? What happens to the New York Times? I would say the next 24 hours were the scariest moments of my life.
As soon as the story was published, Beijing blocked the Times website, including a Chinese language one that had just been launched.
So then the traffic within China to both sites instantly dropped. It was a huge drop, and then advertisers started getting skittish.
And then we faced and still face a ban on issuing new visas to New York Times journalists. We've also, been threatened with repeatedly with expulsion of our existing visa-holding journalists. So far, we haven't literally had an expulsion, but we have had the visas of some reporters that we've hired and tried to transfer from other organizations to ours rejected, so that instead of being able to work for the Chris Buckley and Austin Ramsey, right? People who were working in China for other organizations came to work for the New York Times, but were never allowed to be accredited as New York Times reporters, so had to leave.
I think it was unhappiness with the Times coverage, especially with the Wen Jiabao story, and I was collateral damage.
The message is to don't cover the finances of the Chinese leadership and their families. And if we continue doing this, we'll just continue making it harder and harder for you to report. We'll make it impossible for you to add new people, and eventually, you could be left with no one in Beijing, no one in mainland China to cover the country.
Buckley rebased in Hong Kong, Ramsey in Taiwan. By now, Eunice Yoon had moved from CNN to the business news network CNBC.
I think there was a big signal from that experience that you can't look into the finances of the top leaders of the country, and there will be retribution if you do.
To his surprise, however, David Barboza's journalist visa was renewed, and he decided to remain in Shanghai, despite lingering worries about his safety.
I'm still today a little nervous when I go certain places, when I go to Beijing. I have been followed in Beijing a lot, so I'm not completely over it, but I started to think, if we left China, am I really that much safer in New York? I mean, if people have billions of dollars, can they not get me in New York? Can they not get me in Europe? Can they not get me in Japan? So there's nowhere I'm safe. And so I don't think I'm any safer in New York than in China. In fact, it's possible I could even be safer in China because of the uncertainty of the thing. So I felt people have treated me really well. I really love the country. I love the people. I love my job. When am I going to ever have a job like this?
In 2013, Barboza was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his story. Meanwhile, Michael Forsythe, Ben Richardson, and their colleagues at Bloomberg had begun working on another investigative piece, this one looking at Wang Jianlin, China's richest man, head of the giant Dalian Wanda Corporation.
Wang Jianlin, the head of Dalian Wanda, had just made, at the time, the biggest overseas acquisition, which is effectively taking $2.6 billion US dollars out of a country that has capital controls and sticking it into America. And his company was expanding all over the place. They're buying Sunseeker yachts, which you see in the James Bond movies. They've just invested in the highest residential and hotel project in Europe, right, which is building right next to the US and Chinese embassies on the south bank of the Thames in London. The wife is sort of going off to have dinner with Prince Charles at Windsor Castle, and it's just all of this stuff is very, very interesting. But how do these people get to be that wealthy and that in those positions of power? And it was, we thought, an important story to show, A, the rise of this businessman, how he did it, and also who he carried along with him.
And this one I thought much more focused on a company. It was just almost made to order Bloomberg story, I thought, and just about how this company rose up and how so many of the family leaders, the families were invested in this company.
So we started off with that lead that Mike had, which was, if you looked at Dalian Wanda's Chinese company filings, lo and behold, there was the name of a company that we knew to be Xi Jinping's families, because we'd already proved that fact in the Xi Jinping story. There was a Jia Qingling, who was a member of the standing committee, widely rumoured to be very corrupt. We found his son-in-law had been given a very large stake. Not very large stake, so it was a small stake in terms of percentage-wise, but for you and I should imagine, it would be a very juicy stake in terms of dollars. So he'd received a nice juicy stake in Dalian Wanda, for no apparent reason.
By late 2013, the story was ready to go.
Fully edited, fully fact-checked, had been vetted by a lawyer, and generally praised by pretty senior people at Bloomberg, and then all of a sudden it was not. 180-degree turn. That led to a cascading series of events which got me fired.
Well, you've now got senior and mid-level management from both global management and the regional management on a call to discuss what's supposed to be minor editorial tweaks to get the story ready for the final push. They said that we've got bad news for you. The story's not going to run.
Officially, the reason was that the story needed additional work. But in the same call, Bloomberg's top editor, Matthew Winkler, provided what appeared to be the real reason.
He said the Chinese Communist Party, they're Nazis, that's what they are, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot ever since he read a recently published book that was a top seller in the New York Times, right? I've been thinking about how the AP did it under the Third Reich, and how we can survive to fight another day. He said, we will lose it, they will kick us out, we will lose our business in China. So, let's do what we're good at. Let's write stories that are really surprising. No one's surprised that there's corruption in the Communist Party. Why don't we write about the stock market? And then he went on to this weird ramble about how we could do really good stock market reporting, and that was, is China a buy or a sell? And that will help bring down the Nazis. It was surreal, very surreal. So then he turned to the story where he basically just said, the story's not ready.
Forsythe shared the news with his wife, Leta.
I read the draft of the story. I saw that it had been fully fact-checked. It had all of these extensive footnotes. It was like an academic paper, fully footnoted. And I know that the lawyers checked every single fact, and it was all ready to go. And it was very obvious that it was a business decision to kill the story.
In Beijing, the New York Times' Edward Wong heard rumors about trouble at Bloomberg.
The press corps in various parts of China, whether it's in Beijing or Hong Kong, is a very tight-knit place. You start hearing when there are grumblings around reporters, you start hearing about it. Even if you don't know those reporters personally, you start hearing this talk among people that Bloomberg reporters are unhappy, that there was that something had taken place, that story had been killed, and then you start following up on that, and then you find that it leads to decisions that are being made at the very top levels of Bloomberg.
Bloomberg News reigns in investigative reporting in China.
On November 7th, Hong Kong's Next Media, which had also heard the rumors, put an animated satirical report online.
But lately, Bloomberg reporters in Greater China are finding their stories spike.
2 days later, Edward Wong's story with the headline, "Bloomberg News is said to curb articles that might anger China," appeared in the New York Times.
Then there was a witch hunt. So, there's a witch hunt. No one ever survives witch hunts.
At Bloomberg headquarters in central Hong Kong, Richardson, Forsythe, and others involved in the story were grilled by Bloomberg lawyers and HR managers, furious that someone had talked to the New York Times. Forsythe was blamed for the leak and fired.
After a grilling, then I was walked out.
Bloomberg also used a confidentiality clause in the fine print of his contract to impose a gag order on Forsythe, barring him from discussing details of his departure.
I do have limits on that, pretty painful.
But then what happened afterwards was even more infuriating, because Bloomberg not only threatened legal action against Mike, but they also were threatening legal action against me. And I had never worked for the company. I was simply Mike's wife. But they were trying to coerce me legally through all of these legal letters into signing a gag order so that I would never speak about what had happened at Bloomberg. And Mike already had a lawyer representing him.
It was only when Fincher hired a leading Hong Kong civil liberties lawyer that Bloomberg backed off.
I mean, I get nervous talking about it because I'm still worried that maybe Bloomberg will come after me and threaten legal action again. And I feel very firmly that, we do need to be upfront about what happened, but at the same time, this is a very powerful and extraordinarily wealthy media corporation, and so it's not easy to defy them.
Within months, Ben Richardson had resigned in protest.
I mean, I got a letter from them saying, when I left, the day I left, they said, you must sign this form and send it back to us. And it said, I agree to give you access to my home computer, right? I mean, they're still trying this game. And they try these threats, they're just nonsensical.
Bloomberg's Matthew Winkler and a company spokesman declined requests for an on-the-record interview for this report. In early 2014, Michael Bloomberg stepped down as mayor of New York and again took charge of the organization bearing his name. At a meeting with employees, he was challenged about what had happened and gave an awkward, rambling response.
When it comes to doing business around the world is complex. And American values aren't the values of everybody. And the arrogance of us to think, and we all do, me included, that they should be doing what we do. They should have the same beliefs and expression and that sort of thing. It's always disturbed me a little bit. Who are we to tell the world? If a country gives you the license to do something with certain restrictions, you have two choices. You either accept the license and do it that way, or you don't do business there.
I think the reason this all transpired is because I feel very, very strongly that it's our responsibility as foreign reporters to report and document the wealth of China's leaders. And because the Chinese reporters cannot do this. If they do it, they'll go to jail. And to me, the idea of a world where China is the biggest economy in the world and it's forbidden to write about the wealth of the leaders and their massive accumulation of wealth, I think is dystopian. I don't want to live in that kind of world. I don't want my children to live in that kind of world.
Within weeks of being fired, Forsythe was hired by the New York Times in Hong Kong. Bloomberg, meanwhile, having rid itself of Forsythe, made strenuous efforts to mend fences with Beijing. By 2015, the Chinese were granting new visas and even let a Bloomberg reporter ask a question at a press conference during the annual meeting of the Chinese parliament.
I hate to say it, but it looks like that part of their campaign is effective, which is to scare. So all the journalists are worried about what they do in China.
Indeed, the Times Beijing bureau remained under pressure. No new residence visas, continued blocking of the English and Chinese language websites.
The Times has suffered millions of dollars in losses by having the website blocked, having this Chinese language team there that can't, do anything, can't get ads, we can't get visas. There's been a lot of pressure on us.
The visa issues and the website blockages do start to amount to an economic threat to American news media that aren't on equal footing with other international news media or Chinese news media in terms of covering, what's set to become the largest economy in the world.
Some Times correspondents in Beijing joked they felt like hostages, unable to move to assignments in other countries because the Chinese wouldn't give their replacements visas. Ironically, however, at the same time, China's new leader, Xi Jinping, embarked on a sweeping campaign against corruption, targeting many senior officials involved in activities not much different from what Barboza, Forsythe, and their colleagues had documented.
I am not convinced that the government is uniformly against my story. Because people in government, by the way, have talked to me privately and said, congratulations, a lot of them, and said, we can't say that publicly, but a lot of people loved what you did. You actually helped Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, and everyone knew Wen and his family was doing this, and it was outrageous.
And the paper continued to push the limits with its coverage.
There's, a a clash of two very stubborn institutions, the New York Times and Chinese Communist Party.
But the New York Times was virtually alone in its willingness to pursue this kind of reporting.
There's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is there's just not enough reporters. China, there's so many stories in China that demand your time. And so you really have to have a pretty big news organization to actually give people the time to do these stories. And the New York Times certainly is one of them. Bloomberg was one of them. You also have to have the people who are inclined to do these stories. I could spend all day going through documents and not talking to a human being, and I would be in cloud nine. That's just me. I think that might be David too. Although David's sourcing and his human intelligence, David Barboza, is second to none. And so you do have to have people who want to do these and are inclined to do these stories. And then the third reason is, certainly the case with Bloomberg now is, the sanctions, the crap that will come down on your company if you do this is very well known now. If you're another news organization in China, and you're thinking about doing these stories, you know what's going to happen to you because you know what happened to the New York Times and you know what happened to Bloomberg. So do you really want to do that?
But in important respects, being barred from China now is less of a drawback than it was in the 1950s and 60s. That's when the so-called China watchers sat in Hong Kong, peering across a closed border, relying on refugees and reading the tea leaves in Chinese propaganda to figure out what to put in their stories. Today, with China a global economic powerhouse, Chinese companies and the relatives and allies of the elite who run them operate openly in Hong Kong and other international business centers, providing fruitful pickings for a new kind of China watcher, skilled in reading balance sheets and corporate reports.
Hong Kong does maintain more transparency on financial records than some other countries or some other territories, let's say. And so reporters here, especially if they're well versed in the ways of financial reporting, are able to take advantage of those company records and really drill down and look at finances and trace them back to individuals.
Real estate records in Hong Kong are fabulous. The twinning of Hong Kong corporate records, Hong Kong property records with Chinese corporate records is amazing. So oftentimes you can find opening arguments into Chinese records through Hong Kong records. You can find ID numbers, you can find addresses.
In mid-2015, after over a year of fresh reporting, Michael Forsythe's story about Chinese tycoon Wang Jianlin, the story Bloomberg refused to publish and which led to his dismissal, was published in the New York Times. In September, as a conciliatory gesture just before Xi Jinping made a state visit to the U.S. for a summit with President Obama, Beijing granted a resident correspondence visa to Chris Buckley of the New York Times. Michael Forsythe is still barred from mainland China.
Bloomberg reporters are hardworking. They toil at their desks for long hours. And Bloomberg's famous well-stocked pantry ensures endless workdays. But lately, Bloomberg reporters in Greater China are finding their stories spike. The stories are deemed too sensitive, sources tell NMA. According to sources, in the past 2 weeks, Bloomberg killed stories that investigated corruption at state-owned enterprises and implicated several high-level officials.